Once upon a time, an 11-year-old boy named Lucas was passionately curious about science. His heart throbbed with a thirst for knowledge that was unquenchable. Lucas was no ordinary boy, you see. He had a deep-seated fascination with the world around him. His eyes sparkled with a curiosity that was infectious. Every day he would delve into the mysteries of the universe, exploring the depths of scientific concepts and phenomena. His journey took him through the pages of many books, his mind always buzzing with questions. He would spend countless hours watching documentaries, his eyes glued to the screen, absorbing every bit of information. He was captivated by the beauty and complexity of the natural world, from the tiniest atom to the vast cosmos. Lucas found joy in understanding how things worked, in unraveling the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface. But above all, Lucas was fascinated by the stories of the world's greatest scientists. One evening, Lucas's mother shared the story of Albert Einstein, the famous physicist. She told of a boy who was considered an average student but possessed an incredible sense of curiosity. He would ponder over questions like, what would happen if I ran at the speed of light? Or, why does an apple always fall downwards? Einstein's insatiable curiosity led him to question the accepted laws of physics. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was missing in the way we understood the universe. His constant probing and questioning eventually led to his development of the theory of relativity, a theory that forever changed the way we perceive time and space. His theory of relativity, simplified, says that the laws of physics are the same for all non-accelerating observers, and that the speed of light is the same no matter the speed at which the observer is traveling. This was a revolutionary idea, as it directly contradicted the previously accepted Newtonian mechanics. Einstein's theory of relativity also led to the most famous equation in the world, Hmc2. This equation tells us that energy, E, equals mass, m, times the speed of light, c squared. It means that mass and energy are interchangeable. They are different forms of the same thing. Einstein's curiosity didn't stop at relativity, though. He continued to question, to probe, and to wonder. His curiosity led him to make significant contributions in other areas of physics, further demonstrating that a questioning mind is the key to scientific discovery. Einstein's story is a testament to the power of curiosity. He was not the top student in his class, nor was he the most academically decorated, but his relentless curiosity led him to revolutionize our understanding of the physical world. The story of Einstein, a man who changed our understanding of the universe, ignited even more curiosity in Lucas. It spurred him to keep asking questions, to keep wondering, and to dream of one day making his own mark on the world of science. Another night, Lucas learned about Marie Curie, the extraordinary woman who won 2 Nobel Prizes. Marie Curie, a name that sparkles in the world of science, was a woman of immense courage and dedication. Born in Poland, she moved to Paris to pursue her passion for science. Her journey was not an easy one, but she was never one to back down from a challenge. Curie's work focused on radioactivity, a term she herself coined. She discovered 2 new elements, polonium and radium, and her research was groundbreaking, but it was also dangerous. At that time, the harmful effects of radiation were not well understood. Curie spent countless hours in her lab, working closely with radioactive materials, often without any protective gear. Despite the risks, Curie was relentless. Her work was her life, and she believed in its importance. Every experiment, every discovery, was a step forward in understanding the world. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and the only person to win in 2 different fields, physics and chemistry. A feat no less than extraordinary. But Curie's dedication came at a cost. The radiation she worked with took a toll on her health, leading to her untimely death. Yet she never regretted her choices. She once said, "One never notices what has been done. One can only see what remains to be done." Lucas was deeply moved by Curie's story. He admired her courage, her tenacity. He understood that science was not always about fame and accolades. Sometimes it was about sacrifice, about pushing the boundaries of knowledge, even when it meant risking everything. Lucas was deeply moved by Curie's determination to advance science, regardless of the obstacles. Marie Curie's radiance wasn't just in the elements she discovered, but in her unwavering spirit. Her story was a beacon of light for Lucas, illuminating the path of scientific exploration. A path he was ready to walk, inspired by the glow of Marie Curie's extraordinary life. The story of Isaac Newton, a 17th century scientist, was another that intrigued Lucas. Newton's tale begins with a rather ordinary event. He was sitting under an apple tree when an apple fell and hit him on the head. This simple incident sparked a question in his mind. Why did the apple fall straight down and not sideways or upwards? This question led Newton to formulate the law of universal gravitation. It's a principle that we now take for granted, but back in Newton's time it was revolutionary. He proposed that every object in the universe, no matter how large or small, attracts every other object with a force that is directly proportional to the product of their masses, and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. In layman's terms, this means that the larger an object is, and the closer it is to another object, the stronger the gravitational pull between them. This is why the apple fell towards the Earth, the largest nearby object, and not towards Newton, who was much smaller. This law of gravity also explained why the Moon orbits around the Earth, and why the Earth orbits around the Sun. It was a fundamental breakthrough in physics that paved the way for many future scientific discoveries. It helped us understand the movement of planets, the tides, and even the path of a thrown baseball. Newton's story is a testament to the power of curiosity and observation. A simple falling apple led to the understanding of a fundamental force of nature. It showed that anyone, anywhere at any time could make a profound discovery just by asking the right questions and being open to new ideas. Newton's story showed Lucas that simple observations could lead to profound discoveries. It taught him that science isn't just about complex equations and big experiments. It's about looking at the world around us, asking questions and trying to find the answers. It's about seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary. Lucas was also captivated by the story of Charles Darwin, who studied the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin, a naturalist from the 19th century, embarked on a 5-year voyage aboard a ship named the HMS Beagle. This journey took him to the far corners of the world, from the tropical rainforests of Brazil to the rugged landscapes of the Galapagos Islands. Darwin was a keen observer and used his time on the Beagle to study the natural world in all its diversity. In the Galapagos, Darwin was puzzled by the variations in the species of finches on the different islands. Each species of finch had a different beak shape, perfectly suited for the food available on their specific island. This led him to question, why were there such variations within a single species? Back in England, Darwin spent many years reflecting on his observations and collecting more evidence. His conclusion was groundbreaking. He proposed that all species evolved over time from common ancestors through a process he called natural selection. Those individuals with characteristics best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce, passing on these advantageous traits to their offspring. This was a radical idea at the time, challenging the widely accepted belief that species were unchanging and had been created as they are. Despite facing much controversy, Darwin published his revolutionary ideas in his book, On the Origin of Species, changing our understanding of life on Earth forever. Darwin's story taught Lucas the importance of observation and critical thinking in the scientific process. And so, Lucas learned that sometimes, the answers to the biggest questions lie not in the grand theories, but in the smallest of birds and the shape of their beaks. The story of Jane Goodall, who dedicated her life to studying chimpanzees, was another that inspired Lucas. Jane Goodall was not your ordinary scientist. Instead of being confined within the walls of a laboratory, she chose the wilds of Africa for her research. With a heart full of curiosity and a mind keen to understand, she ventured into the Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania, embarking on a groundbreaking study of wild chimpanzees. Goodall's approach was unique. She didn't just observe the chimpanzees from a distance, she immersed herself in their world. She named them, recognized their individual personalities, and documented their complex social structure. Through her patient and detailed observations, she discovered that chimpanzees, like humans, use tools to obtain food, a revelation that redefined our understanding of what it means to be human. But Goodall's work didn't stop at observation and discovery. She realized that the survival of these magnificent creatures and their habitats was at risk. So she took action. Goodall became a champion for conservation, dedicating her life to protect the chimpanzees and their environment. She founded the Jane Goodall Institute, a global community conservation organization, and Roots and Shoots, a youth-led program to foster respect and compassion for all living beings, and to promote understanding of all cultures and beliefs. She became a United Nations messenger of peace and traveled the world, sharing her message of hope and action. Jane Goodall's story isn't just about scientific discovery, it's about passion, it's about perseverance, it's about using one's knowledge and skills to make a real positive difference in the world. Goodall's love for her subjects and commitment to conservation showed Lucas the impact one dedicated individual could make. Goodall's life and work inspired Lucas, showing him that science isn't just about understanding the world, but also about preserving it for future generations. And who knows, maybe one day Lucas might follow in her footsteps, using his own love of science to make a difference. As Lucas grew older, he continued to be inspired by these extraordinary scientists. Each story that his mother shared with him sparked a new flame of curiosity and wonder. From Einstein's relativity to Marie Curie's radiance, from Newton's gravity to Darwin's evolution and Goodall's chimps, all these stories were not just tales of discovery, but they were narratives of passion, dedication, and resilience. Lucas knew that these scientists had faced many challenges. They had to question the known, step into the unknown, and persist in their quest despite the odds. Yet their passion for science, their thirst for knowledge, and their courage to explore had led them to make groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of the world. And so, one day, Lucas made a decision that was as profound as it was exciting. He decided that he wanted to become a scientist. He wanted to be part of this grand quest for knowledge, to explore the mysteries of the universe, to ask questions and seek answers. He wanted to contribute to our understanding of the world, just like the scientists he admired so much. Lucas knew that this path was not an easy one. He knew that it would require hard work, determination, and a lot of patience. He knew that he would need to embrace the unknown, to question the given, and to persist in the face of challenges. But Lucas was not daunted. He was excited. He was inspired. And with this decision, Lucas stepped into a journey of discovery. A journey that would be filled with questions, challenges, and perhaps breakthroughs. But regardless of what lay ahead, Lucas was ready for the challenge, believing that perhaps one day, his story might inspire another 11-year-old to pursue their scientific dreams. And so, Lucas's story intertwined with those of the world's greatest scientists, as he too became one of them. In the pursuit of knowledge, Lucas, the curious 11-year-old, embarked on a journey into the vast expanse of science. He walked in the steps of giants, following in the trails blazed by the likes of Einstein, Curie, Newton, Darwin, and Goodall. Each story he heard, each discovery he learned about, fueled his passion, igniting a spark that grew into a blazing fire of curiosity. Lucas was not just a passive listener in this grand narrative. No, he was an active participant, contributing his fair share to our collective understanding of the world. He asked questions, sought answers, and wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. His thirst for knowledge was unquenchable, his curiosity insatiable. From the mysteries of the universe to the intricacies of life on Earth, Lucas sought to unlock the secrets that science holds. He undertook experiments, made observations, and drew conclusions. Each discovery was a stepping stone, each failure a lesson learned. He understood that science was not just about the eureka moments, but also about the countless hours of hard work, the trial and error, and the perseverance in the face of adversity. As Lucas delved deeper into the world of science, he began to realize that he was part of something much larger than himself. He was part of a global community of scientists, all striving to push the boundaries of human knowledge. He was contributing to a legacy that spanned centuries, a legacy of curiosity, discovery, and innovation. Lucas knew he had a long journey ahead. There would be challenges to overcome, mysteries to unravel, and discoveries to make. But he was ready. He was ready to take his place among the ranks of the world's greatest scientists, ready to add his chapter to the grand book of scientific discovery. And just like that, a new chapter in the grand book of scientific discovery began, penned by an 11-year-old boy with a dream.